Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Michael Bolden. I'm the editorial director for the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. On their behalf, welcome to what's going to be an extraordinary evening. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to applaud Mitchell Kaplan, and in thanking Mitchell, we at Knight Foundation appreciate your leadership here in our community, and we are eternally grateful. We'd also like to thank Dr. Eduardo Padron and for his leadership and continuing commitment to Miami Book Fair, and every single person at Miami-Dade College who makes Miami Book Fair possible. Please. Now, welcome again to this special evening. For the second year, Knight is proud to bring you this assembly of remarkable talent in celebration of artistic excellence. The National Book Awards recognize the best in American literature, and just 2 days ago they announced the winners. We're grateful tonight that more than 20 winners and finalists have traveled here to be with us, to inform, to delight, and to inspire. These aims are at the heart of the work we do at Knight Foundation. Just a short walk from here, on the shores of Biscayne Bay, our founders, John S. and James L. Knight, transformed a family firm into the largest newspaper group in America. That company no longer exists, but we continue their work at the national foundation they left behind. We carry forward their ideals that connecting people with quality information and with each other is essential to making our democracy thrive. We do this by investing in journalism, media innovation, cities, and the arts, which is what brings us here tonight. We don't just support the arts, we seek to invigorate their very practice with experimentation and innovation, and in turn, to help invigorate and transform our communities and to touch the hearts and minds of the people living in them. People like you. Look around this city. Miami is evidence of what is possible when we do that. Today it pulses with creative energy, and Miami Book Fair sits at the center. Knight's commitment to the book fair runs deep through the support of extraordinary events like this, book fair innovations like the Swamp Performance Space, and the broadcast of many of these events on PBS. And so we hope you will leave here tonight delighted, informed, and inspired, that you will feel connections with the words of each of these extraordinary authors, and that this shared experience will help connect you with each other. Your guide this evening is Harold Augenbraum, Executive Director of the National Book Foundation, which presents the National Book Awards. Harold himself is an accomplished writer and scholar. He is a noted translator of Spanish language literature, and he has published 7 books on Latino literature of the United States, including Growing Up Latino, Encyclopedia Latina, and The Latino Reader. He founded the Proust Society of America and often speaks and writes on the future of reading and publishing. So, let the journey begin. Please join me in welcoming Harold to the stage.
There's a reason that I crossed the stage and went to this side, because I'm actually going to be moderating from this side of the stage and the authors are going to be reading from that side of the stage. The reason I'm telling you this is because I haven't told the authors it yet. And so since they're sitting in the front row, I just want to let them know that you're going to be reading from that side of the stage. Good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here. Let me begin by saying thank you to Mitchell Kaplan and Lisette Mendez and to the Knight Foundation for bringing us here again. They really have done an extraordinary job and made us very, very welcome. I mean, I think if you see those booklets that you have in there in the packet explaining everyone who is here and where they're going to be appearing over the weekend, it really is a new and growing partnership, and we're really, really happy with it. And we are especially happy because the Miami Book Fair really is the model for the book fairs, the book festivals across the country. The ones that are growing, the ones in Brooklyn, the one in Portland, all in Boston, they all take the Miami Book Fair as a model. And it really is quite extraordinary. And I think it's because of the fact that it's so much a part of the community and embedded in the community that it's become that model. And I'm going to be very, very brief since we have a big lineup. We have 23 writers here tonight. They've all been honored by the National Book Foundation this year. If you want to know anything about the National Book Foundation, we put a lot of effort into our website, nationalbook.org, so go there and you can look at it. If you want to know more about the writers, look in your booklet. When they're on their way up here, you can do a quick reading of their bio. All I'm going to do is, this is how it's going to go. I'm going to introduce the writer very briefly, just with the name of their book and their name. They're going to come up, they're going to read for 2 minutes. That's 2 minutes. And then I'm going to pop back from the wings, like daisies in the spring. And I'm going to ask a single question about their work. And then they'll go back to the audience. We're going to do that with each one, and then I'll pop back, introduce the next person. We'll go all the way through. So it will be a chock-full evening. If you look in your program, you will see where they will appear the rest of the weekend. So anybody you like tonight, you should just mark down and make sure that you go and see. Because what they're going to do is they're going to have 15 or 20 minutes during the weekend, so you'll see a lot more of what they do. You'll be able to ask questions, and so it'll be a lot more involved. Now, everybody asked me before we came out here, what order we were going to go in. They all assumed that we were going to go in alphabetical order. We're not. We're going to go completely randomly in the way that they sat down in the front row. So you're going to get a complete mix. It's not going to be just fiction. You're just going to get a mix. Whoever, the way they sat down, that's how we're going to go. So let's begin. Our first reader tonight is Jessie Ball, whose book is A Cure for Suicide.
I had some trouble trying to decide what part I would read because I think it's impossible to take any joy in just one small portion. So probably the task of choosing was impossible, and it's going to be difficult for you all to listen, but we'll see. As I sat in the office of the Cure, he began to speak and explain to me what it was. I was there, and I had no choice but to continue. It seemed there was nothing but that, nothing else. And yet it was being explained to me, almost without my permission, as a matter of course, this thing I did not understand, the cure for suicide. There had been so much progress in the world at large, so many things were solved, so said the interlocutor. My grandfather and his grandfather, even more so, the grandfathers of those grandfathers, they could expect much less than I can, and so on and so on. The general life of man is improving at breakneck speed. But the solutions all have had consequences, and the worst of these, that crops up again and again, he said, is isolation. In the modern world, we, all of us, are isolated. We might as well be furniture, he continued. That is, we cannot feel, we cannot reach out to others. Again and again, the problem comes up. There are those who cannot continue. Therefore, now that so many problems had been solved, this was the feeling in the Republic. It fell to us to confront this final problem, this problem of problems. It fell to us to find a solution, a cure for suicide. Thank you.
Jessie, in reading your book, you seem to call into question the relationships among art and memory and experience. When you were writing, could you distinguish the difference between the three?
Well, I think memory and experience are they're a delirious mix, so I won't try to disentangle those right now. But I think if we want to judge art or to say what art is, it's always best to think about a thing in terms of when it's most useful. And I think that in the worst times of our lives, art permits us to have the company of others. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, beautiful. Our next reader is Adam Johnson, whose honored book is Fortune Smiles.
Good evening. What a wonderful, wonderful audience. This is my favorite place to be as a writer in the world, so it's a great honor. This is just one paragraph from a story called Interesting Facts. The topic of dead wives actually came up a few months ago. My husband and I talked about it while walking home from a literary reading. It was San Francisco, which means winter rains, and we just attended a reading from a local writer's short story collection. The writer was 20-something and sexy. Her arms were taut, her black hair shimmered. And just so you're clear, I'm going to discuss the breasts of every woman who crosses my path in this story. Neither hidden nor flaunted behind white satin, her breasts were utterly, excruciatingly normal, and I hated her for that. The story she read was about a man who decides to date again after losing his wife. It's always an aneurysm, a car accident, or the long battle with cancer. Cancer is the worst way for a fictional wife to die. Anyway, the man in the story waits an appropriate amount of time after his wife's loss, 16 months. Before deciding to date again. After so much grief, he is exuberant and endearing in his pursuit of a woman. The first chick he talks to is totally game. The man, after all this waiting, is positively frisky, and the sex is like, wow. The 40-something widower nails the 20-something gal on the upturned hull of his fiberglass kayak. And there's even a moral, subtle and implied. When love blossoms, it's always the richer when a man has discovered firsthand the painful fragility of life. Well, secondhand. Applause, Q&A, more applause.
Adam, all the stories in Fortune Smiles include an element of risk on the part of the characters. But one in particular, Dark Meadow, is not only about the risk the character is taking, but in a way it's a risk that the writer, you, were taking, it seemed when I was reading it, that you had done. But also, by the end of the story, it seemed to me that I, as a reader, had assumed the risk, and I felt like I was engaging in risky behavior just by reading the book.
Right.
Now, is that what you were going for?
Well, I'm glad you just asked why I wrote about a sympathetic pedophile rather than getting Jesse's question, which was a hard one. I have a friend who has devoted his life to working with sex offenders in the Arizona penal system. And whenever I see him, he is always talking to me about the great humanity of these people and how lives can take a certain path and how difficult it is to come back from them. And as a parent, I was always very skeptical because it's so easy to think of these people as monsters, to project all of our fears onto them and not to think of them as human. But after years of talking about the men he works with and follows after parole, I started to wonder, we believe as a society that every person is valuable, that everyone has a soul, and that the humanity of all is equal. And I wondered about these people, and I wondered, could I find that humanity, through fiction? So.
Our next reader is Neil Schusterman, author of Challenger Deep.
The section that I'm going to read is my interpretation of what it's like to go through a bipolar episode. What do I see when I close my eyes? Sometimes there is a darkness there that goes beyond anything I can describe. Sometimes it is glorious, and sometimes it is terrifying, and I rarely know which it's going to be. When it's glorious, I want to live in that place, where the stars are just marking a vast, unreachable shell like they used to believe in days of old, the inside surface of a giant eyelid. And when I peel back the lid, there's a darkness that truly goes on forever. But it's not darkness at all. It's just that our eyes have no way to see that kind of light. If we could, it would blind us. So that eyelid, it protects us. Instead, we see stars, the only hint of the light we can never reach. And yet I go there. I push past the stars into that dark light, and you can't imagine how it feels. Velvet and licorice caressing every sense. It melts into a liquid you plunge through. It evaporates into air that you breathe, and you soar. You don't need wings because it supports you of its own accord, of its own will resonating with yours. And you feel not only that you can do anything, but that you are anything. Everything. You move through everything, and your heartbeat becomes a pulse of all things alive, all at once. And the silence between each beat is the stillness of things that exist but do not live. The stone, the sand, the rain. And you realize that it is all necessary. The silence must exist for there to be a beat, and you are both of those things, the presence and the absence. And that knowledge is so magnificent you can't hold it in, and it drives you to share it, but you don't have the words to describe it, and without the words, without a way to share the feeling, it breaks you, because your mind just isn't large enough to hold what you've tried to fit inside it. But it's not always like that. Sometimes the darkness beyond is not glorious at all. It truly is an absolute absence of light. A clawing, needy tar that pulls you down. You drown, but you don't. It turns you to lead so you sink faster in its viscous embrace. It robs you of hope and even the memory of hope. It makes you think you've always felt like this, and there's no place to go but down, where it slowly, ravenously digests your will, distilling it into the ebony crude of nightmares. And you know the darkness beyond despair just as intimately as you know the soaring heights, because in this and in all universes there is balance. You can't have the one without facing the other. And sometimes you think you can take it because the joy is worth the despair. And sometimes you know you can't take it, and how did you ever think that you could? And there is the dance, strength and weakness, confidence and desolation. What do I see when I close my eyes? I see beyond darkness, and it is immeasurably grand both above me and below. Thank you. Thank you.
Neil, Challenger Deep is based to a great extent on mental illness in your immediate family. Was there a series of permissions that you had to go through, both from yourself and from members of your family, in order to write this book, and go in public with it?
Yes, the story is inspired by my son Brendan's experiences with mental illness, and when he was in the depths of that illness. And oh, by the way, he's here today with me and has been on tour with me and speaking about the book and mental illness. And he's great now. And you'd never know that he'd been through what he'd been through, but back when he was in the depths of his illness, he said to me, "Dad, it's like I'm at the bottom of the ocean screaming at the top of my lungs and nobody can hear me." I wanted to write a book about that feeling. I wanted to show mental illness from the inside out, but I couldn't do it at the time because he was in this state and we were there with him trying to help him. It was only after the fact, after he really started to thrive, 4 or 5 years later, that I asked him if I could write a book about a teen facing mental illness. Not his story, but a fictional character, but everything within the story would be inspired by both his artwork that he did during that time and by his experiences. And he said yes, and so I wrote it working with him, letting him see the drafts, getting comments from him every step of the way, checking in with him, because I think, to me, the most important thing was that this be something that he wanted to be out there. And it has been, for both of us, a wonderful healing experience.
Thank you. Our next reader is Patrick Phillips, author of Elegy to a Broken Machine.
When you get to be middle-aged, you start to know people who are over 80. So this is about some of the guys I know. It's called My Father's Friends. My father's friends sip natural light, and make these little grunts as they unwind the ace bandages and braces from their elaborately wrapped legs. While a waitress at the 19th hole recites the specials for the second time since we came in, half yelling at the group of cranky, stooped old men who every year give less and less a shit what anybody says. Their menus out at full arm's length as Tom Barnett, the doctor, frowns and squints through whatever's left of his torn retina. As wonder grimaces and orders nothing, as Gary, the ex-pilot, lets a loud, horrendous fart that no one even seems to hear but me, the kid at 40, still awkward and self-conscious in their midst, like some scientist in a herd of big bull walruses, watching as they chuff and graze the last sun chips, debating, it's also true. I don't have time for this. Debating which funeral was best and which a sham, and which dead friend was, let's be honest, rolling over in his fucking grave. Which is when the conversation always fades and they stare off at a screen so far across the room that no one even sees the hit or pitch or photo finish I keep going on and on about. Though out of courtesy to me and to my father, they just smile and pretend. So exhausted are they by my cheerfulness and my quick wit and my long, bright future's plain, goddamned irrelevance. This part's weird.
Patrick, I'm going to ask you a question about craft. When you read your poems on the page, it's a little bit different because your lines are like 20 to 25 characters long usually. I mean, they're very short. But the poems are also often a whole poem, one sentence.
Yeah.
So how do you create the sentence and then break it? Or how do you exactly compose those paintings, those sentences?
I love revising poems, but I compose poems in a kind of terror, like a sort of, I try to get something down and run away before I have I try to trick myself. So I think often once it's like when a kid learns to ride a bike. When I taught my sons to ride a bike, there was this moment when they're like, I'm doing it, and then there's horror, because I'm doing it. And I think that's how I feel when I'm writing sometimes, and I'm terrified. I'm elated, but I'm also terrified. And so sometimes I've gotten interested in extending the sentence as a way to just hang in there. And then that makes you very interested in the ways that syntax can reflect tonal shifts and emotional complexity.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Our next reader is Karen E. Bender, whose book is Refund.
So happy to be here. I'm going to read a little bit from my short story, Refund. What you need to know is that this is set in Tribeca right after September 11th. The son of the narrator is going to a preschool that's a couple blocks from Ground Zero. And they cannot really afford the school they're at. Halloween would be Sammy's last day at the school. The bad tuition check for $2,000 had been sent a week before, and she wanted to stop showing up before they could ask her about it. Sammy dressed as a lion. All the children were in costume. A few mothers were loitering in a lobby, captivated by the sight of their children, pretending to be something else. Sammy's class was populated with 2 miniature Annies, a Superman, a ballerina, 3 princesses, some indeterminate sparkly beings, a dog, and Sammy, a lion. The teacher read them a Halloween story, speaking to them as though she believed they would live forever. The children listened as though they believed this too. Clarissa pressed her hands to the glass window that separated the parents from their children. She wanted to fall into the classroom and join them.
After school, she wanted to buy Sammy a special treat. She bought him a blue helium balloon at a party store. He marched down the street grinning. She lumbered after him, this tiny being with a golden mane and tail. Suddenly, Sammy stopped and handed her the balloon. "Let it fly away," he said. "I'm not getting you another," she said. "Let it fly away," he shouted. "Let it." She took the balloon and released it. The wind pushed it roughly into the air. Her son laughed an impossibly bright, flute-like sound. Other people stopped and watched the balloon jab into the air. They laughed at Sammy's amusement, as though captivated by some tender memory of themselves. Then the balloon was gone. "Where is it?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. Her child looked at her. "Get it," he said.
Well, that's actually a good segue for my question, because I know a lot of the critics have talked about your book in terms of how it portrays money, but as a parent, I was struck by the way you portrayed the relationship between parents and children. It was sometimes exasperating. So what was the reaction that your family had when you portrayed these kids as bloodsuckers in some cases?
Well, our children are not allowed to read the book yet. And, I guess the feeling is, I don't feel like they're bloodsuckers. I feel like parenting is one of the most cutified activities in our culture. You get these onesies that are decorated with, trains and, cute little animals to distract us from the fact that you don't sleep for a year, and I think parenting is so profound and complicated, and it's about connection and separation and mortality and time, and that's what I wanted to get in the book. So, yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Our next reader is Michael White, author of Travels in Vermeer.
One thing I just have to say, besides thank you all for coming, is that Karen Bender and I live in the same small southern town, Wilmington, North Carolina, and if I tried really hard, I could probably throw a rock from my house to hers. So this was a fun coincidence for us. This is a memoir, a meditation on love, that the vehicle is a series of encounters with Vermeer paintings. I'm on my way to see Vermeer, floating up the red carpeted stairs in this high-ceilinged palace. Just before entering the Vermeer room, something catches my eye just to the left of the oak door frame. It's Carol Fabricius's Trump Loyal miniature, The Goldfinch, which I recognized from my reading and which has not yet been made world famous by Donna Tartt's novel of the same name. It's a painting of a domesticated goldfinch on an elaborate perch attached to a whitewashed wall. And the contrast between the off-center, startlingly realized bird and the softly glowing wall behind is striking. Fabricius was Rembrandt's student and was later Vermeer's friend and/or mentor in Delft, we suppose. Almost all of Fabricius's paintings were lost in the Delft thunderclap of 1654, when a gunpowder explosion leveled much of the city. But the goldfinch, especially with its naturalism, cool sunlight, white backdrop, grittiness and ordinariness, seems essential to Vermeer. It's a prelude, a source for the poetry of Vermeer's solitary women. Going into the room, the walls are muted and patterned green. The light which comes from the right as you walk in is shuttered, the effect subaqueous. There's one painting on each wall. Vermeer's great landscape, view of Delft, is alone on the left wall, as luminous as a torch. But I also feel a breeze, a shiver on my back as I enter, causing me to turn to face the girl with the pearl earring to the right of the doorway. I look at her across my left shoulder. She is looking me dead in the eye across her own left shoulder. She is, if any painting ever can be, a breathtaking encounter. Love. How could I have forgotten that feeling? The instantaneous, passionate gaze that comprehends me beyond accusation or forgiveness. The lovely sympathy in her hazel irises, the lush eroticism of her lips, her mouth. She is the clapper, I'm the bell, and she rings through my whole body.
That was gorgeous. That was gorgeous. Now, I'm going to have to preface this by saying there's a nerd alert here, okay? When reading Travels in Vermeer, I couldn't help but think of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. For a variety, okay, all right, come on, all right, so that's what it made me think of, He thinks of love in the afternoon, I think of Boethius. Oh, okay. That, by the way, is Nell Zink, who's going to be reading in a little while. So there's another nerd alert in the front row here. Beyond the themes of that book and to its structure, a poet writing a philosophical memoir in prose, that also goes together with your other book of poetry, Vermeer in Hell. Do you think, based on these two books, would you say that art is inherently consolatory?
I've already heard something to that effect a couple of times tonight, and I think so. What I experienced looking into the depths of these paintings was, I think it was beyond consolation. It was a profound reorientation. Truly, she was the clapper, I was the bell. It was pure response. The book was also pure response. It was almost not a book that I was in charge of writing. And it was also the most purely joyful book I've ever written.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Our next reader is Ross Gay. He is the author of Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude.
Hi. Sharing with the ants. A euphemism for some yank and gobble, no doubt, some yummy tumble or other, like monkey spanking or hiding the salami. Of course your mind goes there, loosey-goose that you are. Me too, me too. You have a favorite? Don't lie, I've heard you say them. Tending the hive, eating the melon. How's the tunnel traffic? Or as a massage therapist would say to my pal when his loneliness dragged him to a carpeted room in an apartment building in Chinatown where the small hands lathered his body, opened the door. Naturally, sharing with the ants, some etymological metaphor, the chronic yoke in lovemaking, not only of body to body, but life to death, sharing with the ants. Or the specific act of dragging with the tongue one's sweat-gilded body from the tibia's lookout along the rope bridge of the Achilles, marching across the long plains of the calf and the meticulously unnamed zone behind the knee over the hamstring into, use your imagination for Christ's sakes. But I will tell you, it is dark there and sweet, sharing with the ants. But that's not at all what I'm talking about. I actually mean sharing with the ants, which I did September 21st, or Friday in 2012, when by fluke or whim or prayer, I jostled the crotch-high fig tree whose few fruit had been scooped by our fat friends, the squirrels, but found shriveled and purple into an almost testicular papoose smuggled beneath the fronds of a few leaves, one stalwart fruit, which I immediately bit in half only to find a small platoon of ants twisting in the meat. And when I spit out my bite, another 4 or 5 lay sacked out, their spindly legs pedaling slow nothing, one barely looking at me through a half-open eye the way an infant might, curled into its mother's breast. And one stumbled dazed through my beard, tickling me as it tumbled head over feet, back into the bite in my hand. The hooked sabers of their mandibles made soft, kneading the flesh, their claws heavy and slow with fruit, their armor slathered plush as the seeds shone above, the sounds of their work like water slapping appear at night, and not one to disrupt an orgy. I mostly gobbled around their nuzzle and slurp, careful not to chomp a reveler. And nibbling one last thread of flesh, noticed a dozy ant nibbling the same toward me, its antenna just caressing my face, its pincers slowing at my lips, both of our mouths sugared and shining, both of us twirling beneath the fig's seeds, spinning like a newly discovered galaxy that's been there forever. Thank you.
You are sort of well known in the poetry world as a gardener as well as a poet. And as a matter of fact, at the reading, the finalist reading in New York, when you got up to read, the first thing you did was reach over and pet the flowers. So I wanted to ask you, and especially after a poem that is so physical, how physical is the act of writing a poem to you?
Good question. How physical is it? That's a hard, you ask good questions. It's actually a kind of a physical, like I write with a pencil and I sit down and have a piece of paper. And so that's a physical act, I guess. But I'll say something else, which is that a lot of my process of writing a poem is about vocalizing the poem, is about speaking the poem. So that probably as much of my not as much, but a big part of my compositional process is putting the poem in my body and then putting it into other people's bodies and hearing it, how it sounds in other people's bodies as I go back to the page. So, yeah, it's a lot about the body.
Yeah, even as you were, I'm sorry, even as you were reading, you were moving.
Yeah.
So it was a physical thing for you.
I think it's interesting that we're dying and we're in front of each other doing this. That's what performance is partly about. We're dying in front of each other.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Our next reader is Becky Albertalli, author of Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda.
Hi. Okay. So Simon is 16 and he just got back from a party. I'm wide awake and still kind of electrified from the party. I think it was good. I don't have a lot to compare it to. It's a little bit crazy to think I had a beer. I know it's astonishingly lame to even think that about a single beer. Garrett and all the soccer guys probably think it's crazy to stop at one, but they're not me. I don't think I'll tell my parents about it. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't get in trouble if I did. I don't know. I need to spend some time in my head with this new Simon. My parents have a way of ruining things like this. They get so curious. It's like they have this idea of me, and whenever I step outside of that, it blows their minds. There's something so embarrassing about that in a way I can't even describe. Telling my parents was easily the weirdest, most horrible thing about having a girlfriend, all 3 times. It was honestly worse than any of the breakups. I'll never forget the day I told them about my 8th grade girlfriend, Rachel Thomas. Oh my God. First they wanted to see her yearbook picture. My dad actually brought the yearbook into the kitchen where the light is better, and then he was perfectly silent for a full minute. And then, that girl has some eyebrows. I hadn't noticed until he said it, but after that, it was kind of all I could think about. My mom was the one who got obsessed with the idea that I had a girlfriend, even though I had never had one before. I don't know why that came as such a freaking surprise to her, since I'm pretty sure most people start out never having had one. But yeah. And she wanted to know everything, how Rachel and I got together and what my feelings were and whether we needed her to drive us anywhere. She was just so bizarrely interested in all of it. And it didn't help that my sisters never talk about boys or dating, so it was like a huge spotlight on me. Honestly, the weirdest part was how they made it feel like this big coming out moment, which can't be normal. As far as I know, coming out isn't something that straight kids generally worry about. That's the thing people wouldn't understand, this coming out thing. It's not even about me being gay, because I know deep down that my family would be fine with it. We're not religious. My parents are Democrats. My dad likes to joke around, and it would definitely be awkward, but I guess I'm lucky. I know they're not going to disown me, and I'm sure some people in school would give me hell, but my friends would be fine. Leah loves gay guys, so she'll probably be freaking thrilled. But I'm tired of coming out. All I ever do is come out. I try not to change, but I keep changing in all these tiny ways. I get a girlfriend, I have a beer, and every freaking time I have to reintroduce myself to the universe all over again.
Becky, there are some scenes in your book and some language in your book that might be objectionable in certain quarters of the United States.
My dad.
You'll have to read the book to find out which they are, and one of them comes at the end, so you have to read the whole book to find out what they are. But have you had any pushback on that, and how do you respond?
I love this question because my first instinct is to be like, I'm surprised at how little pushback I've had. And then when I really think about it, there has been pushback. It's just been really subtle. And I think the form that it's taken is that, like, I think it's pretty clear from the cover copy that this book is about a gay kid. So far that's, like, kept the homophobes away pretty well. But what I'm seeing is it's the people who say that this book is not appropriate for middle school, which is fine. If that's about the, can I cuss? If that's about the word fuck, I get it, I do. But if, when I see people including a comparable heterosexual love story, and this is a really nerdy book, I mean, this kid is a nerd. He gets no act. I wrote this book. Like, he gets, like, I cannot write a book about a kid who has sex in high school. Like, I am not capable of such coolness. So, so like a comparable heterosexual love story is often considered appropriate, and my book is not. And I think, I don't take it as a diss on me. I think it's really problematic to the middle school kid who's being told that their nerdy love story is inappropriate, and I hate that. So, yeah.
Our next reader is Lawrence Rabb, author of Mistaking Each Other for Ghosts.
The poem I'm going to read is called The Sirens. It is spoken by one of the sirens from the Odyssey after the end of the story. And after all of the sirens have grown tired of luring sailors to their deaths on the rocks and have decided to pursue a different life. The sirens. After a while, we got tired of singing. One morning out on the rocks with not a ship in sight, we all felt it, a certain weariness, a malaise, if you will. We felt it together, sympathy having become one of the finer aspects of our nature. We've drifted apart since those days, yet we're happy being remembered as impossible to resist. The legends used to claim we knew the future as well, all things which shall be hereafter upon the earth, as our song put it. Everyone only assumed we were beautiful, but we were. and are, though not unlike so many other women now, those who promise much less, but let you live. It was a relief to give up our powers willingly. That didn't happen often in our world, where the gods went on amusing themselves with their meddling and the hero plowed ahead, lashed to the mast, dying to be tempted. Did we enjoy the clamor of shipwreck, the cries of the disillusioned? It was our job, our particular talent. We weren't supposed to want anything else.
In reading Mistaking Each Other for Ghosts, I get the feeling that you find the bromides of everyday life really annoying. And that a recognition of the extraordinary seems to be its antidote. So how does the composition of a poem to you act as an antidote to the tiresomeness you see in everyday life?
Okay, I'm actually a big fan of everyday life. There are a few things that I enjoy more than getting up early, making a cup of coffee, and sitting down by myself with a poem. But I understand that in a poem, everyday life needs to become extraordinary in some way. And by becoming extraordinary language, or what one hopes is, as so many of my fellow writers here have made, that restores the familiar. That restores the ordinary. It restores us to the kind of life that we too easily take for granted.
Our next reader is Martha Hodes, author of Morning Lincoln.
Good evening. Hello, everybody. I'm going to open by reading the next to last sentences of Morning Lincoln. Mourners knew that Lincoln's assassination had changed the world irrevocably, but no one could know what would happen had he lived. The blast of the Derringer at Ford's Theater on the night of April 14th, 1865, was the first volley in the war that came after Appomattox, a war on black freedom and equality. I'm just going to say a bit about the book. I traced my fascination with Lincoln's assassination to September 11th, 2001. The first plane hit the towers before I left my New York apartment, and the second as I was walking to work. 9/11 made me wonder, what did people do at home, on the street, with their families, by themselves, when they heard the news of Lincoln's assassination? I wanted to understand a catastrophic, transformative event on a human scale. I wanted to explore how personal responses to the assassination illuminated larger national concerns: freedom, equality, and the very meaning of the Civil War. To write the book, I read hundreds and hundreds of diaries, letters, and other personal writings from the spring and summer of 1865. I read Union and Confederate, black and white, soldiers and civilians, men and women, children too, rich, poor, the well-known, and the unknown. As it turned out, these diaries and letters illuminated irreconcilable visions of the nation's future and of the war's meaning. To close, then, I'm going to read the opening sentences of Morning Lincoln. The play had already started when the Lincolns arrived. As the honored guests made their way up the stairway to the dress circle, the actors stopped and the audience cheered. As the band struck up Hail to the Chief, the president took an impromptu bow. It was Good Friday, April 14th, 1865. Thank you.
You just linked September 11th and Lincoln's assassination. So I would ask you, is there such a thing, in your opinion, as shared mourning and shared grief? And do you think that we can learn anything from the study of shared mourning and shared grief that will help us to, if catastrophic things happen again?
Well, the second part of your question assumes that there was shared mourning. Lincoln's mourners wanted to believe in a universal kind of grief, and they wrote in their letters and diaries all the time about the nation in mourning and the universal mourning after the assassination, but they also knew that wasn't true. They knew, and I found in my research, that the defeated Confederates celebrated Lincoln's assassination. There were white Northerners who were gleeful over Lincoln's assassination. And people who wrote in their diaries and letters about this universal feeling of grief would sometimes in the very next sentence write about a neighbor who had cheered when the news came. That lack of shared grief also struck me on September 11th. I remembered it all these years later as a moment of universal mourning. But when I went back to photographs that I had taken on the morning of September 12th in New York, I had photographed signs that people had put up, and there was quite a bit of tension and contention in those signs about revenge and justice and the media and who to trust and who to distrust. The last part of my answer, I think I will go to Lincoln's famous speech, his second inaugural address, which he gave 6 weeks before he died and the Civil War was still on. And in that address, Lincoln asked for a just and a lasting peace. And if we think about how resonant those words are today, today we say no justice, no peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next reader is Nell Zink, author of Mislaid.
Hi there. I'm going to read a bit from right in the middle. This is a closeted lesbian in the backwoods of Virginia in the 80s, who's also a closeted writer. Her daughter is away at a summer program, is away from home for the first time. So, every few years, every 5 years or so, she sits down and tries to write a play because she'd like to be a playwright. So this is her 80s play. Meg took advantage of Karen's absence to start another play. It was about the commander of a death squad in El Salvador who falls in love with a nun he's supposed to massacre. In the early drafts, they were a man and a woman. They were always in bed by Act 1, Scene 2 because they didn't have much to say to each other. She decided to draft them as lesbians to make them more communicative. Afterwards, she could go back and change the death squad commander character to be male. But it didn't work. The open-hearted death squad commander refused to seem male to her. She rewrote him as a man, pouty, sarcastic. Instantly, the nun became a solicitous bore. He ignored her, and there they were again, back in bed. She tried again, establishing the female character first, in scenes with other nuns. Now the death squad commander seemed superfluous. She made him win her heart away from the nice nuns by being even nicer, but they were both so unsexy as affectionate chatterboxes, the love story just fell apart. They had to ignore each other to get anything done. She tried one last time. She rewrote him as a complete jerk. Instead of falling in love with anybody, the commander said he would kill his own death squad to have sex with the nun. Afterward, the nun went to bed with him to reward him. It was kind of sexy. Meg saw a distinct pattern to it: patriarchy. She had wanted to write about idealized partners, but the impressive men she had known weren't anybody's partner. They were lone wolves and dictatorial heads of families. The idea of partnering with a powerful man, well, it sounds nice enough, but even on paper it won't fly. A novel ends with a wedding for a reason. Partnership is anti-dramatic. Partners are not adversaries. Partners don't fuck. Yet she dreamed of loving a lesbian partner. Was she stupid? Lee, that's her husband, she's run away from. He's a gay poetry professor, but he did have a weakness for her because she was kind of one of those soft butch baby dykes who's really cute to everybody. Lee had been sexy to her at one time, but it wasn't because they had a relationship. It was the opposite, because they didn't. And then she stupidly became his partner. She wasted her love on a wolf. What an excellent use of her youth and beauty. She glared at the typewriter, blaming it for her existential angst. She finished the play with the nuns sacrificing the other nuns one by one to protect the death squad commander from the revenge of the dead death squad friends. She tore it into very small pieces and buried it deep in the trash can. Then her daughter comes back from camp. Over milk and cookies, after Karen's return, she confessed to Karen, her daughter, that she had no idea what Karen wanted out of life. "You're a cipher," she said, "a mystery. What are your ambitions and desires? When I was your age, I wanted to write plays."
In Mislaid, characters change sexual, gender, racial, legal, every self imaginable, often based on their current needs. Do you think in the book, or even not in the book, that there is an unchanging self to characters, or does everybody shapeshift in that way?
I think that to a great degree there are biological, factual, and scientific essences and sociological facts that determine our lives to a degree we don't want to admit. However, I also believe that when we step out in public to present our social selves, most people are not paying that much attention. You know, when I was a young woman in the early 80s, I worked as a bricklayer in Tidewater, Virginia, and I had short hair. And once I was out at a bar talking to a female friend and this kind of preppy guy who was really into my friend for about an hour, when he finally made her a compliment by saying, "You know, Megan, you're a real male magnet." And he had thought I was just me. I mean, look at me. He thought I was a guy because my hair was short. What I'm saying is that maybe identity isn't as malleable as people wish it were, but what you can get away with is very malleable.
Thank you. Our next reader is Angela Flournoy, author of The Turner House.
Hello. So the only thing you need to know for what I'm going to read is that a haint is a ghost. It's a Southern colloquialism for ghost. ChaCha transported Chryslers throughout the Rust Belt on an 18-wheeler. The job was the closest thing to an inheritance that he received from his father. After his 25th birthday, the old man took him to his truck yard, introduced him to the union boss, and ushered him into the world of 18-wheelers, all-nighters to St. Louis, and the constant, cloying smell of diesel fuel. ChaCha joked with his brothers who joined the service that he was more decorated at Chrysler than all of them combined. This wasn't a warmly received joke, but it was true. He held records in the company for fewest accidents, best turnaround times, cleanest cab, leadership, and dependability. He did this for over 3 decades until, if what he saw was really what he thought he saw, the haint tried to kill him. ChaCha was driving a full load of SUVs to Chicago during a storm. His rig at full capacity was a sight to behold, 5-ton gas guzzlers stacked like toys in 2 rows behind him, one supported by a metal overhang perched right above the roof of ChaCha's cab. He had reached the M14 just past Ann Arbor when, according to the police report, a deer darted onto the highway, causing a sedan to swerve into ChaCha's lane. ChaCha, in turn, veered off the highway and into a ditch. "He ran me off the road," was the first thing ChaCha said when he woke up in the hospital. "Who ran you off the road, baby?" his wife, Tina, asked. She put a plaintive hand on his arm cast. I knew he'd come back. Who? Come back from where? Layla said. ChaCha put his free hand on the bed, made to sit up and see who else was in the room. Just sit still, Cha, Tina said. I got the remote right here. In the awkward seconds it took for the mechanical bed to raise him, ChaCha remembered the night before. He saw the car to the left of him swerve into his lane, and he'd swerved, true enough, but only onto the shoulder. Then blue light, that familiar flickering and fear-inducing blue from the big room filled his cab. He couldn't see the road to pull back onto it. He remembered clamping onto the wheel then and hunching his shoulders forward as he tried to make out the road. He couldn't do it. And just as he conceded this point, he heard a fluttering similar to the fluttering of the curtains that had roused him from his sleep so many years before, a sound like a multitude of moths, then silence. His old haint had found him and almost destroyed him in a matter of seconds. His truck dragged along the brush for several hundred feet before slamming against a tree that was big enough to hold its ground. His seatbelt did not catch the way it's supposed to in such an accident, and ChaCha's body bounced around the cab, up to the roof first, then hard against the driver's side door. He broke 6 ribs, his left arm, his collarbone, and, as if someone somewhere saw fit to initiate him into old age, his left hip. Thank you.
The Turner House seems to me to be a perfectly balanced novel about a family, and it has 15 or 16 characters just in that immediate family. I know you must have gone through many drafts to try and get it balanced. Did you ever obsess about one character or even the house, or fall in love with a character that sort of began to take over the book and get it unbalanced?
Yes. So a lot of writers will probably say that the person who is the villain is like the most fun person to write. So in this novel, there's 13 siblings, and the 12th sibling, Troy, is he's a cop. He works for the Detroit Police Department, but he's just a big jerk. And he wanted to be all over the book. He wanted to like have a lot of sex scenes and go on vacation to Germany. He did a lot of things in former drafts, but it's really not his story, and a novel is not a democracy, so he had to go. But jerks are fun.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next reader is Robin Cost Lewis, author of Voyage of the Sable Venus.
I think my takeaway from the evening is going to be the novel is not a democracy. Indeed, indeed. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to read a poem that is from a suite of other poems that aren't in the book, but what you need to know is that the poems are about architectural design or architectural structures as metaphors for parenting, and they run the gamut from different millennia and different locations on the globe. This one, they're all called Mother Church number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one is called Mother Church number 3, and the subtitle is The King Quetzal Yellow House, Chaco Canyon, San Juan County, New Mexico, Anasazi Ruins, AD 1125 to 1130. I forgot to say, it's every year when my son's birthday is, I try to write him a poem or a series of poems, and I try very hard not to write Hallmark cards. So this is Mother Church number 3 for Henri at 2 King Quetzal. You step down into the flat world, then ask me to say it, to explain how our name can mean both ancestor and enemy. Your body begins in 4 directions. Here, one calendar takes 18 years. I am 3. One day is an eyelash. Your body is a segment of prehistoric road, a buried stairwell with only the top stair obvious. We are alluvian, obsidian. Sometimes the ground swells with disappointment. Sometimes we know our mountains will be renamed after foreign saints. We sing 900-year-old hymns that instruct us in how to sit still for 49 years through a 50-year drought. We climb down through the hole anyway and agree to the arrangement. Thank you.
In Voyage of the Sable Venus, history sort of presses against you without smothering you, but there also are very beautiful personal lyric poems in the collection.
Thank you.
But those poems are also very much focused on the body in most cases. So I wanted to ask you about whether you think the personal and the political meet at the individual body.
Yeah, I pretty much think they're inseparable. I always joke that it's not really a joke, it's whine, that I'm a pastoral poet stuck inside of a post-colonial body. I really would like to be writing about leaves, birds of paradise, all these things. But like, Thoreau on Walden, he wanted to escape, he wanted to transcend and go to this place and write about nature, but what he encountered were runaway slaves at every turn. And so there's a way in which I think that history is constantly interrupting our fantasy to transcend away from our bodies. And so I try in my poems to have both occur simultaneously.
Brilliant, thank you. Our next reader is Ada Limon, author of Bright Dead Things.
Oh, hi. Hi. It's 2 minutes, so I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to go right in. The great blue heron of Dunbar Road. That we might walk out into the woods together and afterwards make toast in our sock feet, still damp from the fern's wet grasp, the spiky needles stuck to our legs. That's all I wanted, the dog in the mix, jam sometimes, but not always. But somehow I've stopped praising you. How the valley, when you first see it, the small roads back to your youth, is so painfully pretty at first. Then, after a month of black coffee, it's just another place your bullish brain exists, bothered by itself and how hurtful human life can be. Isn't that how it is? You wake up some days full of crow and shine, and then someone has put engine coolant in the medicine, and on another continent, and not even crying helps cure the idea of purposeful poison. What kind of woman am I? What kind of man? I'm thinking of the way my stepdad got sober, how he never told us, just stopped drinking, and sat for a long time in the low folding chair on the Bermuda grass, reading and sometimes soaking up the sun like he was the story's only subject. When he drove me to school, we decided it would be a good day if we saw the blue heron in the algae-covered pond next to the road, so that if we didn't see it, I'd be upset. Then he began to lie, to tell me he'd seen it when he hadn't, or to suppose that it had just taken off when we had rounded the corner in the gray car that somehow still ran. And I would lie, too, for him. I'd say I saw it, heard the whoosh of wings over us. That's the real truth, what we told each other to help us through the day. The great blue heron was there, even when the pond dried up or froze over. It was there because it had to be. Just now, I felt like I wanted to be alone for a long time in a folding chair on the lawn with all my private agonies. But when I saw you and the way you're hunching over your work like a puzzle, I think even if I fail at everything, I still want to point out to the heron like I was taught. Still want to slow the car down to see the thing that makes it all better. The invisible gift, what we see when we stare long enough into nothing. Thank you. Thank you.
In reading your poetry, I always get the feeling that the poetry itself helps you to act, to make decisions, because there's so much in your poetry about having made decisions and making decisions. Does the writing of the poetry actually help you to act, or is it the other way around? Is it a description of that decision?
Yeah. I've never written a poem to help someone else. I've only written a poem to help myself, selfishly live, survive. I think that for me, that the poem has always been a place where, despite all of the darkness in the world, there still remains a radical hope. And when I'm in the depths, I feel like I can write myself out of it through finding that through the written word. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Our next reader is Cy Montgomery, author of The Soul of an Octopus.
On a warm day in mid-March 2011, I met my first giant Pacific octopus. Her name was Athena. Aquarius Scott Dowd agreed to help me, and this is what happened. Athena is about 2.5 years old and weighs roughly 40 pounds, Scott explains as he lifts the heavy lid covering her tank. I mount the 3 short steps of a small movable stair and lean over to see. She stretches about 5 feet long. By the time Scott has propped open the tank cover, Athena has already oozed from the far corner of her 560-gallon tank to investigate us. Holding to the one corner with 2 arms, she unfurls the others, her whole body red with excitement, and reaches to the surface. Her white suckers stretch up like the palm of a person reaching out for a handshake. "May I touch her?" I ask Scott. "Sure," he says. I take off my watch, remove my scarf, roll up my sleeves, and plunge both arms elbow deep into the shockingly cold 47-degree water. Twisting, gelatinous, her arms boil up from the water reaching for mine, and instantly both my hands and forearms are engulfed by dozens of soft, questing suckers. Not everyone would like this. Fear of the octopus lies deep in the human psyche. But Athena's suction is gentle, though insistent. It pulls me like an alien's kiss. Her melon-sized head bobs to the surface, and her left eye swivels in its socket to meet mine. Her black pupil is a fat hyphen in a pearly globe. "She's looking right at you," Scott says. As I hold her glittering gaze, I instinctively reach to touch her head. Victor Hugo wrote, "As supple as leather, as tough as steel, as cold as night," of the octopus's flesh. But to my surprise, her head is silky and softer than custard. Her skin is flecked with ruby and silver, a night sky reflected on the wine-dark sea. And as I touch her with my fingertips, her skin goes white beneath my touch. And she seems as curious about me as I'm about her. Slowly, she transfers her grip from the smaller outer suckers at the tips of her arms to the larger, stronger ones near her head. I'm now bent at a 90-degree angle, folded like a half-open book as I stand on the little step stool. I realize what's happening. She's pulling me steadily into her tank.
You stated somewhere that you believe that all your work is based on ignorance, that you're trying to, and the need to satisfy your curiosity, which I would call sort of a constructive neurosis. So in this book in particular, but in your work in general, if that's the case, how do you get from this not knowing anything and with an overwhelming desire to know everything to actually pulling it into a book?
well, I want to be surprised. I kind of expect to be surprised. And, you know, you read a lot of stuff before you go to Borneo to meet the orangutans and before you stick your arms in these tanks. But the part that always surprises you is kind of giving yourself over, giving your emotions and your intuitions, using that as like a tool of inquiry. That's when you're always going to be surprised, because what animals have to teach you is something that resonates but always renews you. And in that way, I'm constantly surprised and awestruck and gobsmacked by this world.
The next reader is Michael Paterniti, author of Love and Other Ways of Dying.
Thank you, guys. This feels like an awesome version of literary speed dating. And I think my clock is started here. So my book is 17 sort of essay journeys. And I'm going to read really quickly from a trip I took to meet a Ukrainian giant. And all you need to know about him is that he lived in a tiny hovel with his tiny mother, his tiny sister, and he was still growing. He'd had an operation when he was a child, and a pituitary gland was nicked. And so he continued to grow and grow. So this is near the end of the visit. Here were the basic facts. He would die having grown to 8.5, 9.5 feet. Perhaps as the tallest man that ever lived, a title he'd never wanted. He would die a virgin without ever having had a lover, without having close friends for that matter. He would die without children, having made it to Germany once, but no farther. It would have been many years since he'd been able to run or swim. He might or might not have a suit to fit him when he was put in his casket and lowered by the village men, at least a dozen of them, into the earth of Podolansky. Until then, he clung to this other world, half made of dream and half made of manure. I have no bad thoughts about the end, he said. He ate ice cream, sucked down a dozen raw eggs at a time, chewed cold pig fat, sang, and slept with 3 stuffed bunnies. He fell into bitter moods, cursed his God, then contritely read his Bible. He received his pilgrims and told them the tale of his life, hugging himself, gazing out the window while Larissa, his sister, came and went, muttering words like beets and melons. He wasn't an angel or a beast after all, just a man forming his beliefs from the body he'd been given. He said goodbye among the apple trees, where he'd first said hello, crushing my hand again, his face turning the colors of the leaves as we drove away. But I remember him most vividly in a moment just before leaving. I went for a quick walk to see the cows. When I returned, I came upon him standing in the shadow of the apple trees, leaning against his gate, looking out from his stone house at the landscape. The red oaks on fire now, villagers using their wooden plows to turn the fields, the sun coming down just opposite him in the melancholic end of day. He had no idea I was there. He just breathed it all in. There was a presence behind his eyes, not just his enormous brain and eardrums, but him, his himness or soul or whatever. It was a moment where he just was, contented. He stood against the fence, and a neighbor child drifted by. The neighbors had cherubic boys and girls, blonde and fresh and smiling, like he once was. Maybe in another life, one of them would have been his own, light enough to hold up in one hand. But now hidden in the shadows beneath the apple tree, invisible, Leonid gently said, Dobry den, which sent the boy skyward. He hadn't seen the giant there at all, and that was before factoring in that the voice belonged to an actual giant who happened to be his neighbor. "Dober den," the boy said in a startled whisper. He looked up into the branches, gazed upon Leonid's face there, and stumbled. Then he put his head down and hurried on.
In the introduction to this book, you wrote that writing can be a means to transcendence. So how can writing be a means to transcendence, and what transcendence are you talking about?
Okay. In brief, I think it's a conditional transcendence and a personal transcendence, but it's also part of what I wrote there also was sometimes this comes after hours, days, weeks, months, years of doing the work, of committing yourself to the words. And for me, when I go somewhere deep into a story, I'm constantly encountering these other selves that are me, that happen to be people speaking to me from other places, in other worlds, showing me who I am. And in the best stories and poems that I read, I feel like I am carried by the writer to these places, and I keep recognizing myself. And that, to me, is transcendence.
Very good, thank you. Our next reader is Rowan Ricardo Phillips, author of Heaven.
Good evening. Anyone here from Indiana? Well, this poem takes place in Ohio, so. The once and future king of Ohio. Dawn. 2 roosters stud the side of the road. One of them is dead. The other stands there, stiff in the car's sudden breeze, staring out across the hilly Ohio highway, skyward towards that something slight of bright reds and pinks, a pallid, rooster-feathered hue, as silent as the rooster standing and as distant as the dead rooster on its side. We drove by, my guide and I, too quickly to know if one rooster was waiting for the other, or which had been waiting, or if they'd planned to cross the road together when suddenly something went terribly wrong, either at the end of having crossed it or simply, as happens, during the wait. The whole Ohio highway seemed to know, though. Like the gate of heaven, you see it death as a light or a shining, shunning darkness knows heaven without actually being heaven, being rather just a border, still part of our plausible world of parts, living and dead, male and female, color and color, belief and belief. There's really no reason not to believe or to believe what you see when you see it. But when at speed I saw those 2 roosters trying to figure out what's next for them, as the distances we traveled on the 661 swallowed them whole with wheat, I looked from my passenger seat into the car's rearview mirror and saw nothing that was neither heaven nor Ohio. As the horses stirred and the steeple slept and the state flattened out like a mirror. And am I not a mirror for that mirror? Thank you.
In some of your poems, and just that one in particular, you like to repeat words. Usually it's words that you repeat, but you also translate, and translation is a form of repetition. So it may seem a bit obtuse of a question, but what role does repetition play in your work?
Well, in this book I have poems with the same title, but they're different poems. I repeat a lot of words quite a bit. But I don't think of it as repetition. I think of it like accretion almost like the figure in a fugue. Music gets it right. Van Morrison's Madame George, the love to love, the loves that loves, the love that loves, the loves to love. You don't need to say anything else there. Or Bob Marley's everything's gonna be all right, everything's gonna be all right. And it just builds on itself. And then, so woman, no cry. The repetition is accretion. It's building to itself. It's not everything's going to be all right, feel better, you'll have some money, so women don't cry. It's that it's a statement filled with new things. And I'm not afraid to say the same thing over again, because honestly, at our most feral and vulnerable, how could you do this to me? How could you do this to me? How could you do this to me? Or, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. I can't believe this happened. I can't believe this happened. When we're most ourselves, when our gut is in our head and our head is in our gut, it's not, the myth of literary art is that it's kind of like this endless elaboration of words. But really, you kind of find this, I think, womb-like space where language is really its most natural self. And I think when it's its most natural self, it's not concerned with whether you said a word before or titled something the same way before. It's just rather the right word in the right moment. And when we're most vulnerable, that's the way we are. And that's why we write, right? To kind of expose that vulnerable, implausible, needful self.
Thank you. The next reader is Carla Power, author of If the Oceans Were Ink.
Thank you. My book's about a friendship and a year spent studying the Quran with a traditional Muslim scholar, Sheikh Muhammad Akram Nadwi. And we'd known each other 20 years, but this is the start of our first sort of Quran lesson together. And it takes place at a cafe called The Nose Bag in Oxford, in the UK. Britain starts its Christmas preparations the minute the first leaf falls. So though it was early November, a choral version of O Come All Ye Faithful piped from a speaker. 2 American grad students gossiped about their professors. Gray-haired ladies in cashmere rustled their shopping bags, talking softly of their Christmas finds. I put my copy of the Quran on the table between us and tried to ignore my inner twinge of embarrassment. It felt unseemly somehow, holding an earnest discussion of a holy book out in the open where others could hear us. Briefly, I had a half-formed thought of setting up a cardboard sign on the table, "This conversation for research purposes only." The sheikh saw nothing odd about studying the Quran over mid-morning tea in Oxford's shopping district. My own sense of religion may be confined to houses of worship, but Islam takes a broader view. The whole world, the Prophet Muhammad once observed, is a mosque. At airports during Hajj or pilgrimage season, I've seen the pious prostrating outside duty-free shops and next to boarding gates. Muslim cab drivers pray behind the taxi office at New York's LaGuardia Airport. I once saw a turbaned Afghan man standing on the empty storefront display platform of a St. Louis grocery. Eyes closed, palms curved heavenward, he was praying, connecting with the infinite over Grand Avenue's lunchtime traffic. Akram and I, that's the sheikh, embarked on our study of the scripture through a decidedly more mundane activity, eating cheese scones and sipping strong mugs of English breakfast tea. The sheikh looked nothing like the Western stereotype of a Muslim scholar that day. In his herringbone tweed, khakis, and black lace-ups, he just resembled an affable professor. His beard is shot through with gray, but his face retains a younger man's smooth and open quality. He has eyes the shade and sheen of polished teak. Though I'd known the sheikh for 20 years, I felt nervous. "Sheikh," I opened hesitantly. I've never actually read the Quran. I waited for the gravity of my confession to sink in. Admitting it much in this stage of my career felt shameful, akin to a literature professor revealing she'd skipped Homer and Hamlet. Most Muslims haven't read it either, Akram said brightly, buttering his scone. And even if they have, they don't understand it.
Now, you actually had a family background in Middle Eastern studies, right?
I grew up half in the Midwest and half in the Middle East. So.
Yet you seem to have approached your study of Islam with a bit of skepticism, even though you had a little bit of that background. At what point did that change into, let's call it admiration or hope or something like that? Where was that point where you just sort of said, I feel differently about Islam now?
Well, I mean, I'd studied it, as an undergraduate and a graduate student. So I was predisposed to be fascinated and admiring of it. But the process of reporting the book was this sort of stutter-stop thing. We sort of both, the idea was to see to map out where my views as an American, half Jewish, half Quaker, secular, feminist journalist and his as a madrasa-trained scholar would converge and diverge. So we would, by chapter, I would deeply admire, and then he'd suddenly surprise me with something that really shocked me. And then I would go on to deeply admire him. And so it was a stutter stop sort of relationship that way. I ended feeling feeling really, really deep admiration and respect for him. But he thinks I'm going to hell, and I have some issues with his views on polygamy and until recently, until he changed his mind on child marriage. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Our next reader is Ali Benjamin, author of The Thing About Jellyfish.
A jellyfish, if you watch it long enough, begins to look like a heart beating. It doesn't matter what kind. The blood red atolla with its flashing siren lights, the frilly flower hat variety, or the near transparent moon jelly, Aurelia aurita. It's their pulse, the way they contract swiftly, then release, like a ghost heart, a heart you can see right through, right into some other world where everything you ever lost has gone to hide. Jellyfish don't even have hearts, of course. No heart, no brain, no bone, no blood. But watch them for a while. You'll see them beating. Mrs. Turton says that if you live to be 80 years old, your heart would beat 3 billion times. I was thinking about that, trying to imagine a number that large, 3 billion. Count back 3 billion hours, and modern humans don't exist, just wild-eyed cave people, all hairy and grunting. 3 billion years, life itself barely exists, and yet here's your heart doing its job all the time, one beat upon the next, all the way up to 3 billion. But only if you get to live that long. It's beating when you're sleeping and when you're watching TV, when you're standing at the beach with your toes in the sand. Maybe while you're standing there, you're looking at sparkles of white light on dark ocean, wondering if it's worth getting your hair wet again. Maybe you notice that your bathing suit straps are just a little too tight on your sunburned shoulders, or the sun is too bright in your eyes. You squint a little. You are as alive as anybody else right now. Meanwhile, the waves keep rolling over your toes, one after another, like a heartbeat almost. You can notice it or not. And the elastic is digging in, and perhaps what you notice more than the sun or the straps is how cold the water is, or the way the waves create hollow places in the wet sand beneath your feet. Your mom is off at your side somewhere. She's taking a picture, and you know you should turn to her and smile. But you don't. You don't turn, you don't smile. You just keep looking out at the sea, and neither of you knows what matters about this moment or what's about to happen. How could you? And the whole while, your heart just keeps going. It does what it needs to do, one beat after another, until it gets the message that it's time to stop, which might happen a few minutes from right now, and you don't even know it. Because some hearts beat only about 412 million times, which might sound like a lot, but the truth is it barely even gets you 12 years.
Now, you started this book more or less as a nonfiction piece about jellyfish. So how did you get from a nonfiction piece into a fiction piece, yet not letting go of all of the nonfiction that you put into it?
It's a very murky, dark, messy process. We'll call it dynamic. I had a lot of interest. I was working on a novel about a 12-year-old girl and her older brother, and I simultaneously was really interested in jellyfish for all kinds of reasons. Their evolutionary history, their biology is really fascinating, and most particularly, they are bellwethers for everything that's happening to our planet. They're rising because all of the things that we do to the Earth that are bad for basically every species, including ourselves, perversely are really good for jellyfish. The warming, oceans, pollution, all of it. And so their numbers are rising really, really fast, and scientists now think that they may someday starve whales and penguins to extinction. That's a legitimate thing that may happen, according to some scientists. And I was fascinated by that, and I felt a lot of personal grief over what's happening to the planet. We are on this incredibly beautiful oasis out here in the middle of a vast amount of emptiness, and we're not doing anything for it. And I was brokenhearted over that, and I had this girl character who was brokenhearted over some other things, and the two stories really marched in parallel for a very long time. I'm writing about grief over here, I'm writing about grief over here, and it took me a very long time to really realize that they were in parallel and I could stitch them together. Neither one of them was working on its own, but when I decided to combine them, suddenly I was like, oh, I get it, I get where this is going.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next reader is Ilyasa Shabazz, author of X.
Hello. He comes up to me, real graceful, his hands so large, reach for my shoulders. They cup me, cover me, cure me of some long-held ache. Papa, I whisper. The words flow forth from him, unending. Not a sound to be heard, only the feeling of words, warm and soft like a blanket. Rough as wool at the same time. Scolding and healing, scalding and holy, like the touch of the brother's distant God. I've gone wrong, I've done wrong. Papa, I whisper, I'm sorry. There's no punishment in dreams, maybe. I wake, sweat cold and starving, a soul deep hunger that I've never known how to fill. A line of powder, a line in the sand, a line between the things I know and the things I can't begin to understand. The things that threaten to consume me. I receive a return letter signed by Elijah. The words pour into me, begin to fill me in a way unlike any of the words before them. I feel new, but his words don't. They drum inside me at a comfortable pitch, plucking strings of my soul in places I haven't tried to reach in a long time. Up, up, you mighty race. It's not what he writes, but it's what I hear. Black is strong. Black is holy. We must rise up again. Be proud. Be wise. After I hear from Elijah, Reginald's promise of escape begins to make more sense. It begins to seem that the world is not finished with me. It does not matter who you think you have been up until now. Go forth as a child of God. It does not matter who you've been up until now. I roll these words around in my head. I've been so many things. Son, brother, Negro, Malcolm, nigger, red, homeboy, Detroit red, 22843. Look what has become of me. A number is all I am now. The number erases all that has gone before, stamps it null and void. In the end, I've become a nameless thing. And what this letter seems to be saying is that I can put aside the number now too. I can rise out of this prison hole to become a man of my own choosing. I keep my head down as the guard walks past us, shouting, but I no longer hear them. They think it's enough to make me stand in this row with the others, think it's enough to blind us in the same coarse cloth. My body obeys, my mind rebels. This place, these walls, they don't contain me. That is Elijah's message to me. My mind, my soul is greater than anything that can blind me. I was right all along. I cannot be contained. I don't have to be 22,843 anymore. I can see it now. I can look into a proper mirror here on the wall and see a man, a new man, clean before God and ready to serve. What shall I call myself? My impulse is to start fresh, be someone completely brand new, but it isn't quite right that way. Everything before this moment matters. It all adds up to now. Malcolm was my name as a child. I am no longer a child. Little was once a slaveholder's name. I am no longer a slave. I was Shorty's homeboy and Sammy's Detroit Red, but now I belong to God. It is his voice with which I wish to be renamed now. I listen and listen until I know. I am my Father's son. My way through the world has been paved by him, his challenges, his choices, all bequeathed to me. These things are hard to hold, but I see my life more clearly now. I'm not meant to be part of the things that are wrong with this world, but neither am I meant to run from them. I'm meant to fight against them. I can't hold my own in the ring, but out in the world, I do know how to fight, with words, with truth. Everything that I've lived through has been part of my fight. My father's God, my mother's God, my brother's God. They are one, they are in me. I am my Father's son, still and always. He named me, and I will carry that name, just as I carry a part of him. What I don't want is the stamp of the white world on me, that I must fight against. Throw off the shackles of past ugliness, buck myself free, for that too is Papa's legacy and something I must carry. I bend down, sign the letter to Elijah, Malcolm X. The guards may come for me, the devil may come. The chains and the darkness, all the wrongs of the world may come. The noose, every force that thirsts for the destruction of the black man in America. I am my Father's son. They will always come for me, but I will never succumb. Thank you.
Your book is mainly set in the 30s and 40s, and yet it came out in the same year that Ta-Nehisi Coates' book came out, set more or less in the contemporary era. Do you see, even the way you express it, do you see differences between the 30s and 40s and what is going on now?
No, I think it's very much the same, and I think if we just ignore it and act like it never happened, that it will continue, even 50 years from now.
Okay, thank you. Our next reader is Jane Hirschfield, author of The Beauty.
I write some very brief poems, and I'm going to start with 3 of those and then one normal length. I wanted to bow towards the suffering which is happening relentlessly halfway around the world, no matter what our experience now. So this one first. Immigration and hunger. I misread the journalist's sentence. In this human drama, the police ate the supporting actors. Yeah, it seemed plausible for a minute. It took me a long time to realize it was R rather than 8. I sat in the sun. I moved my chair into sun. I sat in the sun, the way hunger is moved when called fasting. 2 linen handkerchiefs. How can you have been dead 12 years and these still? And this last poem is called Fado. Many of you are probably aware that's the name for a Portuguese form of song of love, longing, loss that originated on the docks, sung by the outcasts of Lisbon. I found out much later that the word also is the simple Portuguese word for fate. Fado. A man reaches close and lifts a quarter from inside a girl's ear. from her hands takes a dove she didn't know was there. Which amazes more, you may wonder, the quarter's serrated murmur against the thumb, or the dove's knuckled silence? That he found them, or that she never had? Or that in Portugal, this same half-stopped moment, it's almost dawn, and a woman in a wheelchair is singing a fado that puts every life in the room on one pan of a scale, itself on the other, and the copper bowls balance. Thank you.
The words in many of your poems seem to defy the laws of physics. And I just want to ask you, do you think that you feel being drawn to it, creating your own grammar and defying that law of physics? And does that lead to paradox and conundrum?
So there's a lot of science in my poems, although not the ones you've read. So I love this question. I love all your questions tonight. They're marvelously ranging. Thank you. So conundrum, I think, is what precipitates literature, art, the explorations of nonfiction. It's when we are fractured and bewildered and torn and puzzled and stopped that we turn to writing in order to find our way from that. Paradox, I think, is where at the end of the book, at the end of the poem, perhaps we are left informed by the richness of paradox. In every wisdom tradition in the world, the wildest form of wisdom consists of nonsensical statements which nonetheless feel meaningful to us. So paradox is, a bit like what Ross was saying. We know we're going to die, and yet here we are alive. We know we're going to die, and yet the world is beautiful. That's paradox. Syntax is how you move from one to the other. It's part of the instrument of liberating transformation that I think all art must be played upon. And so, in a piece of music, if you look at the score, it's sort of like looking at the rational mind. There's a note here and there's a note here. But if you are listening to the cello being played, there is no break between one note and another. And what's held in that moment of transformation in the bowing of the cello is everything that cannot be said or felt otherwise. And this, I think, is what literature exists to do for us. So, thank you.
Beautiful. Our next reader is Steve Sheinkin, author of Most Dangerous.
Okay. All right, this is a nonfiction book, and the main character, Daniel Ellsberg, is most famous or infamous for leaking the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, and this is the moment right in the middle. 3 days later, Daniel Ellsberg and his son Robert carried plates of barbecued chicken to an outdoor picnic table. This roadside restaurant had been a favorite of theirs for years, but today they were not there for fun. Ellsberg had spent the last 3 nights at the copy machine at Sene's office, and he knew he had weeks of sleepless nights ahead. He'd been trying not to dwell on the likely consequences of what he was doing, but was tormented by the image of his children coming to visit him in prison. Within a couple weeks, I would lose the chance to talk to my children face to face ever again, except through glass, he worried. They would read right away and hear on television that their father was a traitor. Mary was just 10, maybe too young to understand, Ellsberg thought, but Robert was nearly 14. And the thought of the boy being sent to this never-ending war in Vietnam was one of Ellsberg's main motivations. He wanted his son to know what he was doing and why. Over lunch, he told Robert about the McNamara study and what it revealed. He explained why he looked so tired. Robert did not seem shocked. At his father's suggestion, he'd been reading Thoreau's Civil Disobedience and about the life of Gandhi, the leader of India's nonviolent independence movement. He agreed that there were times when a person seeking justice might need to take action that could land him in jail. Ellsberg asked his son if he'd like to help photocopy the Pentagon Papers. Robert said yes. They drove to Cindy's office. Linda was there working at her desk, but the rest of the staff was off for the weekend. Ellsberg showed Robert the system he'd worked out. After each copy was made, the top secret stamps at the top and bottom of the page had to be cut off with scissors. Then the shortened sheet was copied again, producing a full-size page with blank white spaces where the top secret stamps had been. It was a tedious process, but Ellsberg wasn't sure what he was going to do with this report or how long he'd be carrying it around. The clean copies would be safer to handle. Robert made the copies. Ellsberg sat on the floor, cutting off the tops and bottoms of the pages. The police knocked on the door. 3 of them this time. Robert let them in. "Your alarm's gone off again," one of the cops told Ellsberg. "Sorry," he said from a spot on the floor, surrounded by thin strips of paper stamped top secret. "I've got to figure out how to do that." The police looked around. A woman at a desk, a man on the floor with scissors, a teenage kid at a Xerox machine. Some kind of family craft project? "Okay," one of the cops said on his way out, "be more careful." Ellsberg dropped his son off at home later that evening. "I learned how to work a Xerox today," Robert announced to his mother. "Oh, did you, dear? That's nice." "Yes," he said. "Daddy was copying all these top secret documents."
Your books often take up what might be considered liberal causes, even though liberal these days is not quite a word in...
I accept that.
Yeah. The atom bomb, civil rights, Vietnam protests. Have you had any pushback? What's the reaction been? It has been from the conservative press, the conservative movements, anything like that, to the way you've portrayed these things?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there has been pushback. I haven't really paid too much attention to it. I think that's a good thing when you get a conversation started and there's pushback on it. I mean, a story like this is not just fairly recent history, but it's immediately happening again now with the Edward Snowden case, and so these issues keep coming back. And what's in terms of the pushback, the most interesting thing I found was that when I was doing my research, I found, John Kerry was the first Vietnam vet to speak out against the war, and he talk about pushback. But there's a picture I found of Ellsberg and Kerry shaking hands, and they were doing this really manly, cool handshake. And he was also one of the first people to call Edward Snowden a traitor. 40 years later, I think that's, talk about pushback that we're thinking about.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And our last reader for tonight is Cynthia Barnett, author of Rain, and I want to thank you all for staying. I mean, I know it's been a long evening, but it's been a fascinating evening, if you ask me. So Cynthia Barnett.
I'm going to read you a few paragraphs from my prologue. For a book of rain, I wanted the prologue to be those rains that filled the oceans 4 billion years ago. But every time I tried to write the science, which is so unknown, it just was never compelling enough. I tried, and I really needed a person to tell the story. And so this is what I came up with. The rain on Mars was gentle and welcome. Sometimes the rain on Mars was blue. One night, rain fell so marvelously upon the 4th planet from the sun that thousands of trees sprouted and grew overnight, breathing oxygen into the air. When Ray Bradbury gave Mars rain and a livable atmosphere in the Martian Chronicles, sci-fi purists grumbled that it was completely implausible. But Bradbury didn't care to conform to the scientific views of the day. On any planet, he was much more interested in the human story. He created a rain-soaked Venus too, but not because scientists then considered it a galactic swamp. Bradbury just loved rain. It fit his melancholy like a favorite wool sweater. Hawking newspapers on a Los Angeles street corner as a teen, Bradbury never minded a late afternoon deluge. And in his 80 years of writing every day, raindrops tapped from the typewriter keys into many a short story and every book. So often making rain the mise en scène for life, Bradbury was on to something. Everyone knows that life could not have developed without water. Life, as we define it, required a wet and watery planet. But the Earth as exceptional blue marble story many of us grew up with is as much a product of the human imagination as the warm Mars sea of the Martian Chronicles. Modern scientists know Earth did not develop as the sole wet and watery orb in our solar system. Earth, Mars, and Venus were born of the same batch of flying fireballs. All three boasted the same remarkable feature: water. What's exceptional about our blue marble is not that we had water, it's that we held on to it and that we still do. While the ancient oceans of Venus and Mars vaporized into space, Earth kept its life-giving water. Luckily for us, the forecast called for rain.
One of the things that I find fascinating about your description of rain is how it's qualitatively different from water. So could you talk about some of the differences in the actual quality of the rain, of the water in the rain?
Rain needs a little something to stick to. So it's not just water. It has to start with a teeny tiny particle of something. So dust, whatever it is. So it's not just water. And the thing I find maybe most interesting about that as an environmental journalist is that lesson that everything we put out into the world comes back to us in one way or another. So whether it be pollution or whatever it is coming back down upon us in the rain.
Thank you. First thing I'd like to do is, first of all, I do want to thank you all for coming. You've been a really wonderful audience, and thank you for staying for this wonderful celebration. But I would like to ask all of our National Book Award authors to just stand up and face the audience, and one more round of applause for all of them, please.
And I would also like to just say one thing. Mitchell Kaplan with the book fair. I'd like to thank Michael for his marvelous introduction. I would also like to thank Harold for this. Come on out, Harold. This was a remarkable evening. What some of you don't know is that Harold has announced his retirement from the National Book Foundation, and we wish him really well in whatever future endeavors that he decides to partake of. But we want him to know that he always has a spot here at the Miami Book Fair on this evening all the time. Thank you, Harold. We're also going to do something very, very special tonight. For those of you who know about rushing around to all the different book fair events on Saturday and Sunday, tonight you're going to have the opportunity to get 24 author signatures, because we're going to do one of the largest book signings ever right afterwards. Lisette and Paola will guide the front row to the autographing area. All of those who'd like to buy some books, the books are available outside, and then you can go into the back area where you can have your book signed. Harold, thank you again, and we thank you all for coming. Yes? Oh, a bookseller's dagger again, right into the heart. No, I'm kidding. Thank you, Harold.